sound is going off.
With him is that he carries his eminence very lightly. Great journalist doesn't show his greatness. And I read his column, and there was mention about Marina's book. And I requested Sahitya Singh, whom you mentioned, Marina, to locate Rahul and Marina. And I like to thank Sahitya Singh and his wife for putting me on to you. It's a very interesting work. And believe me, before I could read, my wife read this. She says, I can't give you the book. This is my copy. I said, no, I'd like to. And then she recommended to our children in California, please read this book so that you also stayed connected with your roots. I know they will not come to my small house in a village, but I'm keen that they stay connected with the roots. So this is how this book is helping us. It's the privilege of the moderator, Dr. Madhuri Chawla, to introduce this distinguished panel and the author. It's good of Marina. She joined 5 minutes before 4, maybe after she had her breakfast. There's a time gap. And Rahul Singh has been, like his father, very prompt. One line reply, but same day, quickly. So I'm grateful to Rahul Singh ji.
Thank you for calling.
Our distinguished friend, Rakesh Batabyal, is a part of us. He is a professor in the Department of Journalism in JNU, but he has been our fellow and he's on our governing body. So I welcome you again and request Madhuri to formally introduce the panel and the book over to Dr. Madhuri Chawla.
Thank you, Dr. Mahendra Singh ji. A very good afternoon to the panelists and the audience who have connected with us today for this discussion session on the book, The Lost Homestead, My Mother, Partition and the Punjab. The book has been published by Hodder and Stoughton in November 2020.
There is sound.
Sorry, sir. Am I not audible?
I can hear you.
I can also hear you.
So I think there is some problem with your... Sir, can you hear me?
No, I'm getting it.
Okay.
Rakesh?
I can hear. Now here.
Yeah, it's okay.
So the book
technology
is the
not
book
a
for
substitute. Yeah,
the book for discussion today is The Lost Homestead, My Mother, Partition and the Punjab. It has been published by Hodder and Stoughton in November 2020, and it has been authored by Ms. Marina Claire Wheeler, a specialist practitioner in human rights laws in London, and she also teaches meditation and conflict resolution. On behalf of National Institute of Punjab Studies, Bhai Sadan, I extend a very warm welcome to Ms. Wheeler, as also to our panelists for the day, eminent journalist Shri Rahul Singh ji and respected academician Dr. Rakesh Batabyal. Professor Ravel Singh was also to join us. I hope he joins us soon. And I'm extremely thankful to the National Institute of Punjab Studies, Bhai Sadan, for providing me this opportunity to moderate a session for such an esteemed panel. The book, which has been taken up for discussion today, is, according to The Telegraph, a fascinating tale drawn, it says drawn, as in I'm being a lawyer, and she's actually, she's used her skills to draw it out of her mother, part travelogue and part biography. And for Shashi Tharoor, the book is, and I quote, more than a family memoir. He says, it is an insightful glimpse into a way small worlds, which are how the way small worlds are forever changed by the impersonal currents of history, unquote. And M. Rajiv Lochan writes that amidst turbulent times, this is a story of carefully crafted equilibrium. And while some critics debate on whether the book is critical enough of the British Raj, the book may actually be seen as a project, and Ms. Wheeler had herself shared in an interview with the Sunday Times that it was a project to bring her Punjabi mother Deep, short for Kuldeep, out of the shadows of my famous father, she says. And at the same time, it also provides her an opportunity to explore her own identity. The project, ma'am, I understand, however, as I perceive and understand after having read the book, must have been a daunting one. The first problem that Ms. Wheeler faced was that Ms. Deep was not very forthcoming, probably due to her father's advice to his children when they fled from Sargodha to Delhi in 47 to never speak about what they had lost. Or maybe because she was afraid of revisiting the details of her past, the partition inflicted trauma, the ordeal of having to leave behind the Sargodha homestead, the beautiful house on civil lines, the garden with its fruit trees, and indeed the whole way of life. But Miss Wheeler took up the task as she believed that now, 73 years hence, she would be able to convince her mother to break her silence. I could actually relate to this book a lot because it took me back into the lanes and bylanes of the time spent with my father during his last days. Just like in the case of Ms. Deep, I also found in my father a reticence to divulge. And I had to struggle hard to get him to speak about his traumatic experiences of partition, of displacement from his birthplace, Lahore, and the extreme efforts he had to make to start life from a scratch, all afresh in a new milieu. Miss Wheeler, a second generation diaspora, sets out to trace the story of her lost roots, and she traces the threads of her mother's past and her own present, if I may say so, in India and Pakistan. And she weaves them into the rich tapestry of the narrative, which has resulted in this book. I feel that each one of us will relate to the book in one way or the other, to the instances of India's struggle for political freedom, of Ms. Deep's struggle for personal freedom, which has been brilliantly narrated without any rancor, or any acrimony in the book. As Ms. Wheeler reconstructs, resurrects, and recaptures the past, many of us would find ourselves reliving that time gone by. Stories of partition, they make the readers, especially the Punjabis, very emotional and passionate. But Ms. Wheeler says that when the past is painful and its meaning contested, as she puts it, whether you are in Sargodha or you are in Sussex, India or Pakistan, it's time to move on. And I agree with her fully. This book needs to be read also for an understanding of and an insight into the events and occurrences which Ms. Deep or her husband had personally seen and experienced. I'm sorry, I really get swayed every time I talk about the book, and I have kept you waiting, kept the audience waiting as they wish to listen to the esteemed panelists whose informed and profound presentations would definitely, I'm sure, do justice to the book. Our first speaker for the day is eminent journalist Shri Rahul Singh ji, the worthy son of his legendary father, late Khushwant Singh ji. And Rahul Singh ji is a very well-known writer and journalist, an alumnus of St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, and King's College, Cambridge. He began his career as the youngest ever assistant editor with the Times of India. And since then, he has served as editor for various publications, including the Reader's Digest. And during this time, he had also set up its Hindi counterpart, Sarvotam. And we have all known him for his profoundness as the editor of the Indian Express, the Indian Post, the Sunday Observer, and the Khalij Times. And at present, he is a syndicated columnist. Rahulji's important writings include Family Planning Success Stories, Asia, Africa, Latin America, which he wrote as a consultant of the UNO, and his book on late Khushwant Singh ji, which he wrote in English as well as in the Punjabi language. Rahulji also engages in social service activities through NGOs like the DKT India, the World Literacy Canada, etc. And he is the founder of the annual Kasoli Literary Festival. We eagerly await your address on this fascinating piece of work, sir. And before I hand over to Rahulji, an important message for all the viewers, you can type your observations, if any, in the comment section. We shall highly appreciate that. And sir, though we would love to listen to you for as long as you are willing to enlighten us, I have this very unpleasant task of requesting due to paucity of time, we shall have to stick to a 20-minute time frame. The mic is all yours, sir, now.
Thank you, Madhuri, and thank you, Dr. Mahinder Singh, for having reached out to invite me for this discussion. Before I begin talking about the book, I'd like to make one thing clear. A lot of people think that Marina, the author, is my cousin, and that she is my father, Kushwant Singh's niece. So I'd like to put the record right. I'm related to Marina only by marriage. Her cousins, it's a little complicated because Marina's mother, Deep, first married my father's youngest brother, Diljit. They got divorced. Actually, Marina walked out, Deep walked out on my chacha, and then she married Sir Charles Wheeler, the BBC correspondent, famous correspondent for the BBC. And but at the same time, Marina's mother, Deep, had another sister called Amarjeet. And Amarjeet happened to have married my father's eldest brother. So as I said, it's a little complicated.
You are related.
Yeah. So it's her cousins, her first cousins are really from Amarjeet's and Anup, another sister who was living in Bombay and who I happen to know. She passed away a little while ago. And Anup's children are also her first cousins. There's a third sister who I don't know at all. So, but I'll leave it at that. I think Marina probably has at least 8 or 9 first cousins from her mother's side, but I am not one of them. So I thought I'd just make that clear right from the beginning. Well, I keep on getting, messages, your cousin Marina or my father's niece and things like that. So, and actually, I think I met Marina only for the first time, only about, I think, 4 years ago at my cousin Pammi, who happens to be her first cousin also, house. And then she has been to our Kushwant Singh Lit Fest in Kasoli, and also to the Lit Fest, the same Lit Fest that we have in London as well. And I think she's got a connection with Kasoli, which she might tell you about later. But she was there in Kasoli attending the Lit Fest. This is only, I think, 3 years ago. So that is my connection with Marina. So meeting at a mutual cousin's house, and also she coming to the Lit Fest. But this book fascinated me because it replicates in many ways my father. He lost his home also. And Marina, going back to Sargodha, where her grandfather and her mother came from, replicates the same thing that happened. My father's village was Hadali, which has now become a small town. And I too was very keen to go back and see Hadali. And it became very difficult. My sister and I tried once, and we had there's this foolish visa regime on both sides of the border, India and Pakistan. They make it very difficult for Indians to go to Pakistan, and Pakistanis make it very difficult for Pakistanis to come to India. Really foolish, very bureaucratic. And I might like to, I think Marina also mentions that in her book. Anyway, she was lucky because she's got a British passport. So it's easier for her to go to Pakistan than it is. Now it's virtually impossible for anybody from India to go to Pakistan. Anyway, I tried once with my sister, no luck. Then the second time, we made it clear at the Pakistan High Commission in Delhi that we wanted to go to Hadali. So you have to mention where you want to go in Pakistan before they allow you to go to that place. The same here. It's not that the Pakistanis make it very difficult. India also makes it very difficult. Every Pakistani coming to India has to mention where exactly he's going to go. He has to report to police stations and all. Anyway, to cut a long story short, my sister and I were able to finally go to Hadali. And though in Marina's case, she could not find where her grandfather's home was. In my case, I found where my father's house was. It was in ruins. There was a goat straying there around. There was no roof. It was all. But there was one thing, that was the school that was there. And this person who I'm going to mention figures in Marina's book quite prominently, a very unusual Pakistani called Fakir Ijazuddin. He is the one who drove my sister and me down to Hadali. And there, it's a very touching story, this, but he had become quite close to my father, Pushpant Singh. And he asked my sister and me that after my father died, that please keep some of his ashes for me, because I would like to take those ashes back to his village, Hadali. And he made a marble plaque and he put my father's name there, and the fact the school, that this was the school he went to, and that marble plaque is there at the moment. Very touching story, that. And I can't remember the exact words, but I think Marina mentions them in her book, the exact words that were put in that plaque. So Fakir Ijazuddin, he came to two of our Kasoli literary festivals. And I must say that one of the most heartening aspects of that literary festival that we have, which we named after my father, is the fact that we were able to get Pakistanis, at least for the first 3 years, coming to the literary festival. And they came, most of them came from Lahore, across the border. We arranged their travel, and the sessions that they had were absolutely packed. And they were packed mainly by young military officers who were posted in Kasoli. Kasoli, as you know, is a cantonment, and it was actually packed. And then relations became rather bad between India and Pakistan. But the Pakistanis who came there, they said, you know, in our country, it would be impossible for an Indian to come to a military cantonment. And here we are in a military cantonment. And then when the Pakistanis could no longer come, a retired general who lived in Kasoli, he said to me, please try and get the Pakistanis back, because he enjoyed having them so much here. And they interacted. They were, of course, nationalist Pakistanis, and they interacted with the audience in a marvelous fashion. And as I said, those sessions were packed. My father, the reason we had Pakistanis coming was my father was very keen to promote Indo-Pak relations. Now, later on, maybe I can ask Marina, but I'd like to mention that, you know, I think the Indians who left Pakistan, who came as refugees, I think there were two kinds. One with a bitter hatred of what had happened, and a bitter hatred towards Muslims. Then there was the other kind and I think Marina's grandfather was amongst those, though he had lost everything, but yet there's touching pieces in a book about her grandfather, though he wanted to close that episode, he had no hatred towards the Muslim, only love. And there's a very nice passage where a wedding took place, I think, in the family, and Pakistanis who had been close to them from Pakistan came to attend that wedding. So there was this kind of dichotomy, really, amongst Indians who left Pakistan. One lot, like my father and like I think Marina's grandfather, who had no hatred towards the Muslims, and the others who were really very bitter about it and reacted in a different way altogether. Now I don't want to take up too much time, but I just like to mention the main what I got from the book. One was, of course, Marina, I think, feeling at some point in her life, maybe only about 6 or 7 years ago, that she wanted to recapture or go back to her upbringing and Pakistan and her mother. And fortunately, her mother was still alive then. And so she had to, I think, cajole her mother to talk about Pakistan, partition, and also her grandfather and how he, through her mother's eyes, how he must have reacted to partition and the loss of everything. And also, I think she mentioned this, I can quote it, but I think I'll just leave it at that. She mentions about how disappointed her grandfather was when Marina's mother, Deep, walked out of her marriage with my father's youngest brother. And somehow she never forgave Deep for that. And there's a very touching passage there about that. But her mother Deep's connection with India remained, mainly with the family. And I think she went to India, I think Marina mentions 3 times, went back to India, once to bring Marina's elder sister Shri to India to meet her relatives, another time to bring Marina herself to India to meet the relatives, and a third time I forget now. But then after Deep's mother passed away, I think she was the strongest connection that her mother Deep had to India. And after her mother passed away, she did not want to go back to India again. And I might ask later on, Marina, why this rejection of India after her mother passed away? And she also talks quite a lot about how she viewed bringing up her 2 daughters, Marina and Shri, and how she, I think the word that Marina used, she didn't want them to be confused. There again, I've got the quotations in the book, maybe I can quote them later. She didn't want them to be confused. And she wanted, I think, them to be brought up as English ladies, basically. But then Marina, I think more than Shireen, at one point decided she wanted to capture her past. And this book is really all about that. And it also talks a great deal. I think Marina read a lot about Indian history, Pakistan history of that period, just before partition, and partition, of course, and a little bit after partition. So she had read a lot about that. So I think this was for her, a kind of discovery of the Indian subcontinent. I think I must have run through my quota of time, but yeah, I think I have run through whatever. The other thing which because Marina was lucky enough to be able to go to Pakistan, I think twice or thrice, and to interact with the young new generation of Pakistanis. I'm curious to know, because I went to Pakistan when this is, I think, 2003 or 4 for a literary festival, and I noticed from yesterday that Marina's just been on a virtual Lahore literary festival. I was also invited to a Lahore literary festival. I think this must have been at least 14, 15 years ago. And at that time, the visas were easier to get. And I was part of a veteran tennis team. And I remember going, it happened to be one day when the one-day international between India and Pakistan was taking place at the Gaddafi Stadium. And as you know, India and Pakistan are real traditional rivals in cricket. And I went to that, and it was so touching to see this new generation of Pakistanis who were cheering for the Indian team. I could not believe it. They were, and when they saw us Indians, some of us Indians, clustered in, we were all sitting in a kind of enclosure, and they started coming, wanting to talk to us, cheering us. It was a new generation of Pakistanis. And I wonder how Marina must have interacted with this new generation and how they feel about India. Have they been, because they had no experience of partition, or did their parents pass on some of their experiences of partition to them? Maybe I could ask her that later on. I think I must have run out of my time. So, Madhuri, I'll get back to you. There is one more point that I noticed in the book about how I think the words she used about her mother is that she had sealed up the past and had no intention of letting in the light. Beautifully put. This is about had sealed up, her past, meaning her Indian past and Pakistani past, and had no intention of letting in the light. And then she wanted to get a job as an educational psychoanalyst. And she was told that she would have to first psychoanalyze herself. Isn't that correct, Marina? Yeah, so that she would have to first psychoanalyze herself. And she didn't want that to happen. She did not want a psychoanalysis for herself because it would then go into the past, and I don't think she wanted that to be opened up. So she instead decided to be a researcher at Amnesty International. And she gave up that possibility of that job just to be maybe Marina can talk a little bit about that as well. So sorry, I've got more questions than a commentary to make, but these are some of the points that came up while I was. It's a fascinating book, beautifully written, simply and beautifully written, straight from the heart. Her disappointment when she goes to Sargodha, trying to locate where her grandfather's house, which her mother had told her that he was the king of the castle. I think that's the word she used, king of the castle. And she just can't find any trace of the house. And how the people she meets, they seem to have obliterated what happened at partition. And I think there's even a professor who's got a very, very strange account of what happened at partition, as if nothing happened really, nothing happened in that area. So I found that rather odd, and it must have been terribly disappointing for Marina. It comes out of the book that she could not locate her grandfather's house, and with all those fruit trees and vast fields and all that, she couldn't somehow find it. And nobody could help her even tell the history of what had happened or history of that area. The only place where she was successful was in locating the the female hospital, which her father, her grandfather, had actually was responsible for. And she had a photograph of 8 people, including the governor of Punjab, the English governor of Punjab, which she, and I think it lies there in the female hospital. But that was, I think, one of what Marina says was one of the proudest achievements of her grandfather was building this or setting up this female hospital in Sargodha. Okay, Madhuri, I think I've gone well over my time, and I'll now leave it back to you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for highlighting some very significant aspects of the book and, of course, raising some very pertinent questions. And you talked about this dichotomy amongst the Indians who left Pakistan. Yeah. Those with a great sense of bitterness and others who did not share that bitterness. Your father, as you said, did not carry that bitterness with him. In case of my father also, sir, I remember he was never bitter. He had narrations of suffering, but that bitterness was never there. And as you pointed out, because of these foolish visa policies, I am today probably glad I did not get the visa. I wanted to go for a Varisha conference and I waited for 2 days for that visa, which didn't come up. And my father had given me his address to locate his house. And I wonder whether I would have found something there or only a goat tied up somewhere. So maybe in a way it was a blessing in disguise. It may have been completely disappointing experience. Thank you so much, sir. And we'll, I think, take the questions at the end of the session. And we'll move on to our next panelist now, our other esteemed panelist for the day, Professor Rakesh Batabyal. Professor Batabyal is an alumnus of JNU and he teaches at the School of Media Studies, JNU, and he specializes in philosophies and histories of media and moral philosophy, technologies and transformations, and rhetoric and propaganda. Besides being a popular teacher, he has made his mark as a postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, honorary fellow at the National Institute of Punjab Studies, New Delhi, and was also the Indian chair, Graduate School of Information Studies, Tokyo University. In his illustrious career, Professor Batabyal has got several publications to his credit, and his scholarship has been recognized and he's been awarded by various institutions like the Kansai University, Japan, Virtual Teaching Society of India, Asian Review of Humanities, Nepal, Archival Management, Ministry of Culture, Government of India, Government of Poland's Institute of Remembrance, University of Bucharest, and the University of Budapest. He was also invited by Bhai Veer Singh Sadan to be a member of the Executive Council of the Sadan. So on behalf of the Sadan, I once again welcome you, Professor Batabyal, and request you to enlighten us with your impressions of the book. We are all eager to hear you, sir. And it's my duty to repeat the same request of a 20 minutes time frame. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Madhuri. Good afternoon. And this is, in fact, came as a surprise when I was asked to be part of this panel, because I'm a Bengali and Bengali speaking non-Punjabi. But as Dr. Mohinder Singh has made it a mark to suggest that I am a honorary Punjabi in that sense, I'm here. This has been for the last 20 years. There's an insistence that I write on Punjab because my PhD doctoral work has been on the Bengal partition. My book called Bengal Communalism in Bengal from Famine to Noakhali, published by Sage, is an account of Bengal partition and the violence, the first work on Noakhali riots. After that, there was I won't say partition, but communalism is where my heart lies and mind works. And it is part of that subconscious eagerness, I would say, with which I read the book. So that is one caveat. The second caveat is that to me, history is too important. It is so important that I was nitpicking when I was reading the book, and I would detail. I found two tropes in this book. There are two kinds of historical narrative that Marina has yoked in order to give her narrative a run. So there are two kinds of history, and that is quite legitimate in the sense. And this goes back again to a very, very profound issue that her mother actually raises for all of us. And that is, in fact, her suggestion. This book, when she writes, the author admits that, mother, Kuldeep and Deep in short, Deep suggested that the title should have been From Sargodha to Sussex. So I don't know what made Marina change. In fact, the Lost Homestead, My Mother, Partition, and the Punjab is the title of the book. But I would rather take that title very seriously, as I would take Deep very seriously, because this is a book which is a daughter's tribute to the mother. And in that sense, Deep was quite intelligent in this sense that the book also reflects that intelligence of the mother by saying that let's bypass what had happened in the other part where families moved, because there I think the weakness of the narrative for us becomes very apparent. The strength of the narrative of the book is in Sargodha. It is in reconnecting with Tiwanas, reconnecting with Miss Salek's heritage, reconnecting with the hospital, and reconnecting with the legacy of education that the Punjabis had created, which is very underestimated, undervalued, and I would say not even recognized in a great sense in independent India as well as in independent Punjab. The way Punjab as a province and Punjabis of all kinds, particularly Sikhs and Hindus, have contributed to the creation of the network of educational institutions, educational philanthropic institutions. Forget about Gangaram, but every city had people like Harbans Singh and others, Harbans Singh being Deep's father, that's Marina's grandfather, who helped set up the medical hospital. He helps when the government college teacher or principal, Miss Salek, needs her house to get renovated. He gives part of the house for her to relocate for some time. So in this sense, the Punjabi contribution to the education and philanthropic networks in erstwhile Punjab, the larger Punjab, has been where this book actually, if anyone who does education, if he or she reads this book, he'll have a sense of that in a different way. It's in a very narrative, in a very nicely told ways, but there are senses coming up. And Deep is in fact the product of that education and a social ethos or social vision of the Punjabis of the pre-partition, I would say late 19th century and early 20th century vision that the Punjabis had built, where the girls got education across the communities, particularly with the Hindus and Sikhs. For example, the DAV society and the Panchal Bhaginis and all kinds of things among the Sikhs also. The women's education and the girls' education became such an important figure in their social vision. And that gets reflected in the post-partition constitution of institutions in India and more so in Delhi. And Delhi, in fact, Delhi and Eastern Punjab, that is part of Haryana today, Eastern Punjab became, if what is today educational hub, it is partly because of those, or partly I would say mainly because of the people who came from that side, carrying that earlier vision in which Marina's grandfather, Harbans Singh, he shows that glimpse. So in this sense, I would say Sargodha and the Western Punjab travels of Marina gives us a sense, because in a practical sense, as a researcher, I can't visit Pakistan. It's just as simple as that. So she is in a privileged position to go there and sends out some first draft of research. So in that sense, future historian like me or many of my students and Madhuri's students will get the benefit of a kind of first draft of research by Marina. What has happened? There are two PhDs which I was trying to glean through while I was reading. As a very boring scholar, I went back to look for other works around that line. So there are two PhDs I found where they studied a comparative study between two cities. One is Gujranwala and Lambala, and the other is I think Lealpur. And so what happens after that? No, in the similar fashion, I don't have a city to compare with Sargodha. And Delhi is a poor comparison, because in Delhi, Marina belongs to a class of, and here the history becomes a class act. All her relations, all her connects, all her references are far removed from general people who are staying, who are standing, who are concerned about the farmers' protest today. So this is a class act. This is a slightly, let me bring my historical framework in which Sargodha is where she goes to people. Here she goes to spectacles, literary festivals, Shashi Tharoors, Ramchandra Guhas. These are what is we call a chiclet history, Chetan Bhagat kind of thing. So there, everything is hunky-dory. Gandhi is also wrong, Nehru is also wrong, Jinnah is also wrong. Jinnah is also right, Nehru is also right. No, that is not what the Indian historians have worked. I was quite sad that Marina could not find time or even reference, or somebody even not even bother to tell her that Indian university historians and Indian history Congress historians and Indian whatever you call boring or pedant, they have done tremendous work and unmatched work in the world, even on the issue of partition, beyond Urvashi Butalia's other. That's not a historical in the sense that you engage with history, fight with history. So there, you cannot write a history of Britain in the post 45 without consulting an Oxford or Cambridge or Liverpool or Sussex historian. Here, you have done that without consulting the foundational work of Anita Inder Singh, Sucheta Mahajan, Gopal, who named a range of people in Punjab University, in JNU, in Delhi Pratap, Calcutta University. And why this becomes important is because partition is not for us a closed case. Because next two months, Bengal is going for an election where partition is the issue, where a second partition is happening in the country in a manner which is much more devious, because there won't be any bloodshed, there won't be any migration of people, but people will be divided. People are increasingly made to get divided. So therefore, as a historian, your narrative, or Marina's narrative of Indian part, is in that sense not connected with what is happening in the actual history. The museum of, say, Amritsar, this is a new, or other part of Jallianwala Bagh. These are what is in the new liberal phenomena we call consumption of history. People are trying to consume history. In that sense, it's a new phenomena. It's not history as where the history is happening as a process. One has to ask, what is it that the farmers from Punjab, Haryana, and across the country are reliving Uddham Singh? They're reliving Bhagat Singh. They're not in the pages of A.G. Nurani or Ramchandra Guha. They're not there. They are bringing back history to replay the game. The legacies, the inheritances, the encourage. Gandhi is alive every day in these farmers' tents. Nehru is live every day. The amount of attack that he gets, he's far more live today than he was when he was a prime minister, because it is his secular idea that we are trying to fight for. Now, this is where I would go back and say Sargodha is our future. The girl who says to you, and beautifully, she says she doesn't want to live in India, in Pakistan. I'm quite, I got shuddered because are we going to do the same with our own part? That tomorrow the girls would say, I don't want to live, the younger generation, I don't want to live in India because I want to go to the West or wherever I have freedom. So are we going to do that? So if we want to make, as somebody had criticized, somebody had even made a statement, I think that some people want to make India as a Hindu Pakistan. I don't buy this argument. But if we go the same way, and this is where Marina's books becomes a very, very important document. I would say not even a first draft. It's a very finished document for those who are fighting, who are contesting, who are writing history, who are seeing history every day unfurling in different parts of this landmass, to see what had happened. For example, it is very difficult it is very easy for the last 70 years to get Congress as a punching bag. Whatever wrong is Congress. Okay. Similarly, it is also anyone who tries to objectively understand partition. In India, for example, Bipin Chandras or Khushwant Singh or there's so many historians. I can't even exhaust naming them. Now, they will immediately call one-sided history. But as professional historians, they're the best in the world. On the other hand, you have difficulty. In fact, yesterday I was reviewing Ishtiaq Ahmed's book, and even in his own session a couple of days back, he says he's the first one to bring this. Ishtiaq Ahmed is the professor of history in political science in Uppsala University, and he has written this book on Jinnah, who is now rightly so celebrated. And he would argue that he is the first one. We would say that this kind of work has been happening for the last 50 years in India. So many historians have written. That means it's the inter-intellectual interactions are not happening. People are not reading. Or what the non-resident historians in Harvard and Cambridge and Oxford have done is to bring this equivalence between, in Pakistan, you have Muslim nationalism. In India, you had Hindu nationalism. We never called Hindu nationalism. We called it conceptually rich Hindu communalism. Now that has been equivalent, and therefore historians and historiography has also got this equivalence. Therefore, anyone who objectively, historiographically presented rich documents of history partition are referred to as something that either ignored, you don't even quote, you don't even bother. So who comes? Therefore, in Pakistan, Professor Abdul Rashid, who gives a Muslim League's perspective, it becomes a generic perspective there. But to get another perspective, you go to Aisha Jalal outside Pakistan. But in Indian historiography, you don't go outside. Here, there are different contending versions available. Forget about Shashi Tharoor and all. These are the new rhetoric populist, I wouldn't say historian, but they actually take other works of the previous generations and say, and then articulate in a different manner. But in the historical debate, that doesn't happen. Therefore, my concern and my, in fact, appreciation of the book is not about my disagreement about historical narrative of the Indian part. Let it be there, is a historian debate. But what this book and the author has done is to bring us a mirror of what awaits us in case we are not very careful. What awaits us, that the house is razed, there's nothing, no memory, nothing is left there. And on top of it, a new society which has come are still valorizing the same feudal network relations with army and big landlords. India in that sense has changed. And any hint that that change is going to be reversed is being fought by people on the street. And as we see in the borders here, so we have new borders. So therefore, this part, I would congratulate the author for bringing us that mirror. The second is, as I was mentioning, I was trying to see why Deep was trying to kind of close or kind of have a eraser of the interregnum period between. And this I found very interesting many of the Pakistani students in say US and Britain, in fact, one of the PhD theses, and you can download and read that, by Nida H. Ahmed. It's called Muslim Women in US from Pakistan. It's a preliminary psychological or psychoanalytical work. And I could sense that when you, because for Deep, it was not a very tough act as other hundreds and thousands of women must have gone through while the process of partition was on. Here you found a host, you found a house, so you transited to a well-settled upper-class Delhi family, from where you move to another set. And therefore, what were the issue, what were the concern that she would have? I think she understood, given her educational capital that she had, that being in the West, being a Sikh or Asian woman, she might find double asymmetries. One, the domestic asymmetries that women generally find in a patriarchal setup, and the larger social asymmetries where an Asian or a non-Christian woman would find herself. So in order to avoid both asymmetries to get reflected back on the family, home, and the children, she in fact trying to bring an eraser to that past of her transition. In that sense, I would say one of the silent protagonists of the novel is the journalist Wheeler. I think he shows that post-war where Eric Hobsbawm and other historians, the Marxist historian, come from. I won't say liberal, but it's a British liberal setup where the sense of justice is there, a sense of looking at the world from a different perspective than what the British official perspective of recreating the empire, which began in the 50s. So there is a clash between the establishment and this profession of journalist and this person with a strong British middle class, or I would say, I won't class as other class, but middle class sensibilities emerges. Very, very just. I think that together makes a kind of very sweet underlying theme when Marina herself reflects that sense of justice, where she talks about Ram Mohan Roy and others. But then the readings of Guhas and Tharoors and all derail sometime back. There I think we would invite her to our university to get a real interaction with historians rather than. So with these words, let me thank you for producing this work, and it's a good mirror. And but I would ask my students to actually read that, and if they can find a comparative city in India to see what happened after partition of that city. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Batabyal, for your very thought-provoking exposition. You rightly said that the book brings us a mirror as to what awaits us if we are not careful. And I think we should all imbibe that message, take it with us. You also pointed out the vision of the Punjabis, and I would like to add to that the name of Dyal Singh Majithia as well. As far as education is concerned, the founder of, he's the one who was the founder of the Dyal Singh Majithia Foundation in India, the Tribune, and our college as well. And for sure, the book is a daughter's tribute to her mother. And I'm sure after this very well articulated and informed address, we are all set to move on to what the author of the book has to tell us. We are fortunate that the author, Ms. Marina Claire Wheeler, is with us today. Ms. Wheeler, born to BBC correspondent Sir Charles Wheeler and his wife, Ms. Deep, short for Kuldeep Singh, as we said earlier, an Indian Sikh, is a British lawyer, author, columnist, and she's the ex-wife of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. As a barrister, she specializes in mental health matters, discrimination claims, and public law, including human rights. She's a member of the Bar Disciplinary Tribunal since 2009 and was appointed Queen's Counsel in 2016. Before the present book, she had co-authored the Civil Practitioner's Guide to Human Rights Act. I would request you, ma'am, to share with us your experiences and emotional impact of this journey, the rigor and the effort that went into it as you set out to Sargodha in Pakistan in 2017 in a quest to discover your grandfather's extraordinary house and the hospital there in which he had worked till 1947, his fertile lands in Handewali, armed with just one single photograph of your grandfather at the opening of the female hospital in Sargodha, which was taken in May 1938, as you tell us. And I hope in the process you'll also address the questions which have been raised by panelists. We eagerly await your address on this piece of work, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Madhuri. That's and good afternoon to everyone. Dr. Mohinder Singh, many thanks for inviting me to speak. And of course, as you've already mentioned, Tirlochan and Kanchan were instrumental in affecting that introduction. So I'm thankful to them too. And of course, I hope it's not too informal to use first name terms, but to Rahul and Rakesh, my co-panels, thank you both for the time you've taken to read the book, which I'm really honored with. And of course, also time to hear sit and discuss it. And I've been fascinated by all that that you've said. I'm heartened, I guess this is Madhuri going back to say that I'm heartened that you and others seem to have been touched by it in some way. And I hope in the moments, the 10 minutes or so that I'm going to take to talk a bit about the book, why I wrote it and what I learned, I hope I will be able to address some of the questions that Rahul and Rakesh have raised, some of the issues that have been raised. But also I think, please, if I don't, do ask me at the end of it. But I am so struck, since having written the book, how many people have picked up different threads. And I think it is right to emphasize at the outset that this is a family memoir. It's not a history. And I think as a history book, I would be the first to admit, fall far short. I think what it tries to do is acknowledge from the outset that I approached this as a thorough ignoramus, with a knowledge of India that was pretty much historically centered around the feature film Gandhi that Attenborough made back in the 80s, which is a pretty poor understanding for somebody who is half Indian, half Punjabi heritage. But I'll come back to that, because the historical element is obviously one of the important things that I had to explore and that I discovered. But just going back to the beginning of why I wrote the book, I wrote it in a sense, I wrote it because of a phrase, in a sense, that was echoing through my head as a child from my mother, which is that she had been twice displaced. And I don't think I paid a great deal of attention to this notion as a child. I understood that the first displacement was related to the partition. And I understood that the second was focused on her leaving Delhi and India once she married my father. But that was about it. And it wasn't really until I was jolted by an external event in 2017, the 70th anniversary of the partition and Indian independence, that I think I really felt drawn to try and understand a bit better what that displacement meant for my mother. And very much the book is about my mother, and I think hence the title. And I embarked on writing it hoping to solve what I think were two central mysteries about her. One was about the place she was born, Sargodha. What was it like? I mean, I had no sense other than a very idealized notion that this was paradise. And then the second mystery was, as Rahul has touched on, why, having left India with my father, was she so reluctant to return? So those were I guess, the sort of motivators. I did explore both of those things, and I think Rahul has touched on the personal elements and drawn out from the book pretty accurately what it is that I discovered about my mother from there. I mean, apart from, I think, learning through the eyes of a child who is herself no longer a child, I think I came to understand her a good deal better. I think I came to understand that her reluctance to go back to India was, as Rahul says, very much centered around her sense of having disappointed her father. Her decision as a very young woman, having been married at 17, her decision to leave the marriage was one that she took with a sense of the importance of taking her own destiny into her hands, which was a very extraordinary thing to do in the 1950s, as I say in the book, in that milieu particularly. But the disappointment that her father felt, and the sense of having let him down, I think was a sadness that she never really managed to come to terms with. So I think that was part of it. And then I think simply also this sense of displacement of, I don't think I understood while I was a child, and until in fact I embarked on this, I don't think I understood that this strong desire for us to grow up centered in the West where we lived, and not with a strong connection to India, so not teaching us Indian languages, was on the face of it about not confusing us, but I think in truth it was about my mother's own sense of sadness at having left India, and that bringing India into our lives more than she did would have been something she personally herself would have found difficult to live with. And that was quite a revelation for me. And I was interested that, you know, she came up with this slightly pat explanation to my cousins, who used to say, you know, Pummy is one of them, who I think were very disappointed that we didn't speak, you know, Punjabi, Hindi, in fact, any Indian language at all, and would confront my mother with this. And so her answer was, oh, I didn't want to confuse them. But as I say, I don't think in truth that really, that was only a very small part of the story. So I learned about my mother on this fascinating journey, researching and writing the book. Of course, I also learned about my grandparents, Papaji and Beji, as they are in the book, who I did not know at all, because as Rahul says, as a child with my mother, we only went to India 3 times. And on the 3rd occasion, my grandmother had died. So I never knew my grandparents. So this was a way also of learning about them. And about my grandfather, I knew that he was a pillar of the community from where he had come, according to my mother. But I think I learned much more. But I also learned, I think one of the, you know, the sort of, each family has these stories of their own families. And one of the very sort of simplistic stories that I learned from my mother was about the division in the family between my grandfather, who was very pro-Raj, and his children, who of course were pro-independence. And bear in mind that I'm learning this as a child a long way away from India as well. And I think this is also part of a central thing to do with the book, which is that some of this is communicated in quite 2-dimensional ways. And part of my journey was to try and fill that in a bit, you know, to fill in the color from the black and white. And I learned that my grandfather whilst he held positions at the behest of the Raj, he was the president of the municipal committee in Sargodha, for example, his real motivation, as I understood it, was to serve his community. And that may have been founded in the Sikh faith, or it may have been something else. But I don't think he ever saw himself, as I say in the book, as serving the Raj. One central philosophy, I think, of his life, and again, I take that probably in part from his faith and Sikhism, was his determination to educate his daughters to the same standard as his sons were educated. And, you know, one of the things I learned, one of the very few things, again, I hold my hands up about that I learned about Sikhism as a child, was the dedication to gender equality that I remember, you know, being very struck by. But I think that was certainly a thread through my understanding of my grandfather's life as well. And he did indeed educate his daughters to a high standard. My two aunts who went to Kinnaird College in Lahore, and my mother didn't because, of course, partition came in 47. They left Sargodha, and that opportunity disappeared. But I understood and learned as well about my grandfather's enormous love of growing things, fruits, as Rahul has touched on, fruits and flowers, and that whole way of, that rural way of life that, as my mother drew it, was something of an idyll. My grandmother was much less a public figure, unsurprisingly. I think household and faith were central to her life. And again, understanding a bit about her life and what the Gurdwara, what the Langar meant in her own world, and her own world of privilege. And I think I've tried to be very upfront in writing the book about acknowledging that this is a story about privilege. And in fact, as I embarked, I mean, there were people who said, well, how can you possibly understand anything about India if you're just going to literary festivals in, you know, be it Jaipur or Kasauli or, and of course, that's absolutely right. And I knew that there was no way I, as someone, you know, living in the West, traveling to write this book in what was basically 2 years of research, would ever get a proper understanding of the sort of, you know, heart of the experience of ordinary Indians. So I think I took a view early on that I wasn't going to attempt that. I was not going to try and pretend to be something that I wasn't, and that I would follow. In a sense, I would just follow where the story took me. And it took me, as I say, to family. And one place it took me was that I think has made a huge difference to my life and to my sense of who I am, is of course understanding my wider Indian family, not just my grandparents, and, you know, piecing together some of the past. But the way that my wider Indian family, as Rahul has said, you know, that quite an extensive network, they all took part in this venture in different ways. You know, feeding me anecdotes and stories of members of the family they knew who I didn't, sharing memories, finding photographs in the, you know, the sort of abandoned trunks, finding bits of film. And one of my nieces as well, I mentioned in the book, who lives in New York now, but is actually in the US, but is a filmmaker. And she filmed her grandmother, my aunt Anoop, years ago, finding bits of film, contacts, ideas. And this was a wonderful thing to do. And rather than just popping up at a wedding, as my family and I would occasionally do, you know, and enjoying a cocktail and the ceremony, I was able through this to explore our shared history. And I think I feel that as part of my family, and I'll come to this other part in a moment, but also I think as countries, And me as a citizen of Britain, and half English, half Indian, I also felt exploring something of a shared history was of enormous value to me. So this is a personal book, and of course it's also a political book. But I did write it. I guess I wrote it predominantly for a British audience or readership, feeling that although these events, partition and independence, were well traveled as historical events, and you know, Rakesh has rightly sketched out the whole, you know, a breadth of scholarship that there exists in India, which I didn't touch. In part, I think, you know, some of this was I am hindered by not having grasp of Indian languages too. But there is this great wealth of scholarship and digest and consideration of this subject, but it's still extraordinary how it is still in the popular imagination, and I include myself in that, reduced to such basics and sometimes such misleading basics. And as I say in the book, there's a trigger for my doing this. The historical trigger was going to see Gurinder Chadha's film Viceroy's House. And I mean, that was an important film to do on the 70th anniversary, because in the UK, people don't really recall what happened at independence. They don't recall what partition really was about. And I think it is important to bring that history to a new generation. But I don't think she was very faithful she wasn't very faithful as I saw it to a lot of the basic facts. And one thing that I happened to pick up on that mattered to me, and of course different things would matter to different people, was this idea that, you know, the Brits had a secret plan to partition all along, and it was something that suited Britain's geopolitical interests, and through a very elaborate machination that was achieved in the end. Well, that kind of was I found that discordant, and I thought when I saw the film, really? And so I did want to find out how accurate that was. And I think that particular trope, I feel satisfied, was not, or as we lawyers say, doesn't have a sound evidential basis. But what I discovered about the history, and I think, you know, Rakesh has touched on this, is just how contested it still was, is that, you know, and I'm a lawyer, not a historian, but it was fascinating to me to go back and to see something that I knew intellectually, but this made me feel it, I think, was about how subjective history is, how malleable it is, and this ability to go to Pakistan as well and listen to a couple of, you know, history lessons in Pakistan and in India at, for example, in Delhi, was to see what extraordinarily different stories are told about this event. And this may be completely obvious, you know, to you in India, but it certainly isn't obvious, I think, in London. And I don't think it is completely obvious in Pakistan. So I think as the generations go by, the simplified stories just take on, well, they get ever more simplified. So just even the word partition in Pakistan, you know, that implies the loss of a territory, whereas certainly, you know, the official line in Pakistan is this is the realization of a homeland. And that may be an idealized way of looking at it. But I think what one forgets when one listens to perhaps just the, you know, what I think is the dominant, and one might call this, I don't know, Indian nationalist story about partition, I think what one loses in that is, for example, the importance of Jinnah's political journey, why he moves from believing in Hindu-Muslim unity to being an advocate of separatism. And I think, for me, I know this is a subject that is open to so many interpretations, but I was very struck by the enduring problem of how you move from to a democracy, a representative democracy, and ensure that your minorities are properly protected. And it seemed to me that that was a whole theme that I just hadn't understood. I hadn't understood the Muslim anxiety about living in a Hindu-dominated country until I looked into this. And I also hadn't really understood the terrible dilemma of the Sikh community in the Punjab, where the dominant parties, the Muslim League and Congress, came to a position where that division was going to be on a majoritarian basis, and the Sikh community were, dispersed throughout the Punjab. And so it was a recipe for total disaster, as indeed, as we saw with the appalling loss of life that emerged. Anyway, I was determined not to get into this historical level of sort of historical debate. I simply wanted to, I think, touch on this sense of realization of the absolute complexity of analyzing an event such as this. And I think I came away with the feeling simply that we can do better in trying to understand each other's truths. And I've certainly tried to do that. And I feel with the travel to Pakistan as well, that I hope to be able to carry on doing that. And I don't know how I'm doing for time, but just a couple of other thoughts about what I learned. I mean, Sargodha, of course, it was extraordinary to go there. It was extraordinary to cross the Atari Wagah border and find, in some ways, that the similarity between the two sides was so striking, although that was a sort of incorrect and inverted commas thing to observe. It was wonderful to experience the warmth and hospitality of the people in Lahore. It was fascinating to go to Sargodha University, and I think it was, as Rahul suggested, talk to a younger generation as well of Pakistanis to see the narrative from the older professor who'd written a Pakistan movement narrative to the younger academics with much greater openness to the world, who have traveled, who have access to the internet, who want to delve a bit further below and understand a rather less choreographed bit of history. And I found that very, very heartening. But yes, it is absolutely right. I was shocked to see how the past had been obliterated. Perhaps I shouldn't have been so surprised. I mean, I was disappointed not to find the house in one sense, but in the other, I think it was just an understanding then that, yes, the past has been difficult, but I was as heartened by the appetite amongst those young academics that I mentioned, one of whom, Abra, helped me around Sargodha. We didn't initially get the right site for the house, but he still opened a lot of doors to me. He led me to the hospital, to the female hospital that my grandfather had helped to found in 1938. And yes, the act of being able to present them with the photograph of the opening that showed all of those characters from history, from the governor of the Punjab, the British governor and his deputy, who had of course long gone, from my grandfather and the Hindu lawyer, who was also present in that photograph, who had fled in 1947, and to the Tavana family, who were the local bigwigs of the area, who in some sense it had also been the losers of history, in that their brand of cross-communal political cooperation had been pushed to one side by the Pakistan movement. But to be able to present that photo of all of these people who at one time had worked together and built this or inaugurated this hospital that was for women. So it was the first female hospital in the region. And it was a hospital that was dedicated to trying to reduce deaths in childbirth for all women, you know, be they Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, seemed to me a very important thing to be able to do. And so in my second visit, I was delighted to find that the picture was up on the wall, and that in some small way I'd taken my grandfather back to Sargodha. So the ongoing conflict is sad. I'll just end by touching on that. Both Rahul and Rakesh have mentioned that the Indian-Pakistani conflict, the inability to get visas. I think I saw that so clearly as a result of researching this book. I don't think I had any sense of quite how deep that animosity on a political level goes. But I think the whole partition story and looking at this animosity also just underlined that the interests of politicians and the people so often don't coincide. So it seemed to me on this ongoing Indo-Pak conflict that, of course, there are politicians who use this for their own advantage, and that seems to be something that is happening sadly now. How easy it is, as one saw in the partition, to turn people's hearts to hate, for politicians to manipulate that and use fear to create hate. And I think, of course, we understand that's something to resist. But in Pakistan, the desire for people-to-people contact with Indians was so obvious. And I was very struck by both the mirror image in talking about partition, the mirror stories of suffering on both sides, and though the ongoing desire to have a relationship that is, you know, amongst people that know they live under different systems and are different, but they can still be collaborative and respectful. And just perhaps maybe ending, yesterday, a session that I did for the Lahore Lit Fest was screened, and that the wonderful woman who interviewed me, Nelafar, let me know that it had been screened in Kinnaird University. And when it was mentioned, or when I mentioned in the interview about my aunts having been at Kinnaird and how much that had meant to them throughout their lives, apparently a cheer went up in the auditorium in Kinnaird. And what Nilüfer told me was that I must understand and tell my cousins that the bonds are still cherished deeply, and not just amongst the older generation, but amongst the younger generation as well. And, you know, coming full circle, Khushwant, of course, a great part of his life was about Indo-Pak unity. And I think for me, certainly that was a great thing that I come away with as well, is just understanding there is this strong desire, whatever the politics, whatever the bloodshed of the past, there is this strong desire, you know, to reach out and find the commonality, which seems to me to be a very Sikh idea too. So that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Veena. We really appreciate that you made us privy to your valuable experiences and encounters in the making of this book. And it's really heartening to know, as you also said, that there is this desire to for people, person to person, people to people bonding and communication on the other side of the border as well. And as pointed out by Rahulji earlier, that he saw these youngsters cheering for the Indian team. That's one thing that really heartens you, and one would want to believe this and move ahead with the desire to work in collaboration and helpfulness. And since we can't really undo what has happened in the past, so one just does have to move on. And I think most of the questions have been addressed. Dr. Mahendraji had one question to ask, I think. So would you like to ask your question now?
You can ask the question.
Okay. So Mahendraji had a question for you. He says that prominent Sikh families who migrated from West Punjab after the partition, they were known for their traditional values and distinct forms and symbols of identity. And after reading your book, he finds that the second and the third generation have been happily moving on from one identity to another. So do they still feel attached to the traditional pre-partition roots, which prompted you to make 2 challenging trips to Sargodha?
Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, of course, I hesitate to speak for my nieces and nephews, but it is quite true that I have shared some of their stories in the book. And I think it's true that they, as youngsters who I suppose have been exposed to different cultures, as I've said, privileged people who've had the benefit of education in India, but also abroad, I think they are fluid in their identity, but I think they are also still attached. And I think I'd maybe put it this way, that I have the feeling that their identity is not so much tied to a place. I'm not sure they feel a particular affinity or, for example, with Sargodha. And although I traveled there and I was very keen to learn more about where my mother had come from, I'm not sure that as a place means a great deal. But I think there's definitely an attachment, a strong attachment to Sikhism. I mean, maybe, and being Punjabi, and it may not be all the rituals, but I think the values are still very strong. And I think those values, I mean, as I understand the core, Sikh values, humility, equality, service. I mean, I think that is, I've noticed from my younger relatives as well, they have a very well-developed social conscience. I mean, I don't want to generalize. They're a large group, and they're all different and individual, but I think that's a fair strand to identify. I think that means a great deal to them. And I think that, but I think what I also would say, and thinking particularly of 2 nephews who I do recount what they've told me in the book, is that I think they have to find it in their own time and in their own way. So, for example, my grandmother, Amarjit, she did convene the family for prayers at their house and so on. And I think a lot of the youngsters went through the mechanics of it, but didn't really feel that much and went through periods of rejecting it. But then a lot of them come back to it. And I think that's what they've been saying to me, is they've come back to it in their own time. And I think as for being Punjabi, lots of them, may not speak the language. Gurmukhi, I think I discovered, is a thing of the past as far as my family is concerned. But the food and the music and that sense of cultural links, I think that still lingers on. Yes.
Thank you.
So would you like to take on now, Dr. Mahendra Singh ji?
I'm fine. Yeah, I can thank them if you.
Yeah. So Rahul ji also had a couple of more questions in case he wishes to put them across to the author now.
Yes, I think you can. Yes, Rahulji, you can.
No, I think Marina's answered all my questions. No, I really don't have. Let me just. No, I think. I think I don't have anything more to say. But please go ahead now. Yeah.
Can I just, in that case, ask on the question, Rakesh, maybe he could kindly send me as an email some suggestions of further reading.
That's a good idea.
Because I am so open. I am so open to, I see this as just a beginning. And I can think of nothing I would like more than to move a step on and to carry on these discussions, because I think all of this question of what is history and, you know, whose history do we look at is endlessly fascinating.
So apart from, I just wrote a review, so I'll send you the review also. But there's another thing that unfortunately that didn't come up, and this is for Rahulji also. I happened to just finished, and the book is just on the shelves. Amazon has published it, The History of Modern School.
Yes.
And in the process of writing that book, I made forays into the history of Punjab. And Rahulji's family and, you know, the entire family that you describe, I was vicariously had already seen that family very from inside, because Shobha Singh was one of the founding trustees of the family, and Pammi and everyone we were talking about, they're part of the, and I was a bystander. I never interacted with any of them, but through the papers, through the letters, I was reading them. So in that sense, therefore, I was seeing this book as something about an education. It's not about formally going to school, government college, Sargoda, or but also the way these people inculcated part of that social vision that you're talking about, the advanced social conscience, into education is going to be a challenge for us in the sense to how to inculcate in the new education that is happening now. So in that sense, why I spoke about history, and that was in a passionate voice, is partition had not just happened once. For example, in Bengal, there are 2 partitions, and here the kind of psychology, the kind of consciousness that has traveled over the last 6-7 months is the question of losing land again. So therefore this partition is not a foreclosed option. It is in the process of many life stories. Therefore, when you're talking about you're tributing your mother, many mothers from across the world are sending their children here to fight for their land. So that is quite an interesting journey to me. Therefore, as a historian, that's what I was talking about this book as, calling this book as a mirror, that mirror into the future. And historians generally write for the future. No historian worth his salt write for the past. He uses the past for the future. Thank you so much. I'll send you the list if you ever visit this site.
I would love that.
Thank you.
Is there time for one more question?
Sure. Rahulji, please.
Yeah, Marina, you just touch upon this, the British record in India, and Shashi Tharoor has written, about what a terrible record the British had in India. And then there's Zarir Masani, who takes a somewhat different point of view on this. And I think you at times defend what the British did in India. My personal feeling is that if you had to be ruled by any, colonial power, I think the British were the best of the lot. That's my own feeling. The French were terrible colonial rulers. The Dutch were terrible in Indonesia. Earlier on, look at what the Spanish did in South America. All that. The Belgians in the Congo were just horrible.
Japanese.
And the Japanese, of course, what they
terrible.
did when they did this thing. So I think if we had to be ruled by a colonial power, and it was our own fault that we allowed ourselves to be conquered, really, because we were divided. It was just as well that it was the British who ruled us. Can you tell me what you feel about this?
Well, I'll tell you, I am certainly did not intend to be defending the British. And I think I was trying to stand up, stand above as far as I could and just look at what, explore this question of how it looks from all different sides. But I think actually, maybe this is a good way to end. Because I am sitting here in London, and as I said, I think I predominantly wrote the book with a British readership in mind, although I am very heartened that it has seemed to be of great interest in India and Pakistan as well. But I am quite preoccupied here in London with the experience of the diaspora. And I know that maybe for Madhuri, whose subject is the diasporic studies, this might resonate with her, there's a huge diaspora here from the Indian subcontinent. And there is a very interesting discussion going on about, issues of assimilation and multiculturalism, and perhaps it's to the fore because of the Black Lives Matter movement, but it's still been going on for years and years. But I personally am quite focused on this sense that it is important for the diaspora here to, well, not just the diaspora, and for, if you want to call it the host country, to understand the shared history. And, we do hear quite a lot now about the colonial atrocities. Quite rightly, we hear about that. But I also want, I suppose, and part of what I was doing in the book is to show that there is more than that. There were, one example is just the contribution from troops, largely Punjabi, to fighting both world wars, fighting for democracy. That, democracy is something that is a shared way of governing. In the UK and in India, hopefully not under too much threat. But some of those shared bonds and understanding them, I think it's important for the British to understand that the reason there is this huge diaspora is because of empire too. And it's a phrase that, I don't know if you've read a book Satnam Sanghera has written an excellent book, which makes the point, he being a Punjabi here in the UK, we're here because you were there. And I think in terms of properly, assimilating and living together as citizens with shared values, it's very important to also draw on some of those common experiences. And I think, this is part of a legacy of my writing the book, is I think also for me paying a bit more attention to the diaspora here in the UK and helping with this whole important facet of, Britain needing to understand and to come to terms with its own imperial experience for good and bad. And I think that will take time, but I think it's something we all acknowledge has to be done.
Can I come on this for just a few seconds? No historian, no nationalist leader from, say, late 19th century to even today has ever talked about reparation in India. The Indian historiography, academic culture had never, and people have very strong views on colonialism, but they have never talked about reparation. And because the moment you enter into that dialogue, it, as you are lawyer, you will understand it better than me, you are into the retributive justice domain. And therefore, the Dalits, the tribals, the interfishers of Indian society will also come up asking for the same treatment. Therefore, people like Shashi Tharoor and all do in disservice to the already established consensus about not us going into that line. So therefore, Indian historians, I would speak on behalf of them in that sense, where they delve deeper into the colonial system. And that's why you are absolutely right, bringing Nehru and other. Actually, Dadabhai Nauroji to Bipin Chandra, they all understood colonialism as a system of operation, not as a person to person. And that's why Professor Bipin Chandra, who was our teacher, one of the best scholar on colonialism we have ever found, he used to tell us, and I was so happy that you are also echoing the same argument, that most of the civil servants are very well educated. They came to India at a very young age. Half of them died here, more than half died here at a very young age. They did so many good things across the country. So in that sense, it is not an individual British or colonial administration who was bad or good or ugly, but they were also working under some hegemonic notion of colonialism, which they were also part of. They didn't even know that. And therefore, legitimizing ideology is what we are fighting against, not against person or a state. Now, the kind of scholars that we are talking about in the they're making it more popular, is doing disservice to that understanding of Indian history. And that's why one has to come sharp on those things. Thank you. Sorry.
Totally agree. Yeah.
I'm sure we want to go on and on this.
Yeah.
It was indeed one of the most intellectually stimulating evenings that we have had. But as they say, all good things come to an end. And of course, we may wait for another session together. I would like to thank the panelists for highlighting the various aspects of the narrative, Shri Rahul Singh ji and Professor Rakesh Batabyal. Thank you so much for taking out time from your busy schedule to be with us today. Your reflections have made this one of the most enriching and memorable evenings. Also thank the author, Ms. Marina Wheeler, for sparing her valuable time. Thanks also due to Mahendra Singh ji and the team at National Institute of Punjab Studies for bringing this program together. And I think Sir wants to say something, so please. Oh.
I have to announce the next program. And before that, I really want to thank Rahul Singh and Marina. Rahul for continuing the legacy of Khushwant Singh. Sardar Khushwant Singh was a bridge between India and Pakistan. He was a bridge of friendship. And why he was read? Because he talked of spirituality, not religiosity. Religiosity divides us. Forms and symbols, they divide us. And Khushwant Singh, whether Sikh leadership liked him or not, he has been, to my mind, a great missionary of Sikhism. His Sikh history is read more than any other book. So Rahulji, please carry on his legacy of bringing India and Pakistan close. And Marina should also join in this effort. She is fortunate. She can visit both India and Pakistan. And this book, to my mind, has again been a bridge between India and Pakistan. Younger people do not hate. I've been to Pakistan 3 times. This is all love. It's the politicians who create hate. So we have to continue our work like Khushwant Singh and Pradeep Nair did. So I request both of you to continue. And Marina, please come again. Let us wish this corona is over sooner than later and we can have a physical meeting and continue the dialogue. Our next program is a lecture on Professor Puran Singh. He was a great intellectual. He's almost ignored. So on Monday, 22nd, we are having a lecture on Professor Puran Singh by young scholar Jaswinder Singh, and Dipinder Kaur Randhawa will preside over the lecture. And 26, this year is century of the Nankana tragedy. Marina would know a little bit all Sikhs remember the martyrs of Nankana in their Ardas. This is centenary, and the SGPC had planned to take a Jatha to Pakistan, which the last minute, the government these days is becoming very, very generous to the Sikhs. They said, no, because of Corona, you cannot go. Last November, there was no Corona. They went to Pakistan, but this February, they cannot go. So I'll be talking about these Nankana martyrs on 26th. Thank you very much again for finding time.
Thank you.
Maybe we hope
Thank you so
again.
much.
Thank you, Marina.
Bye.
You.